This is 50 Shades of Green by Climate Group, your monthly climate podcast exploring all the essential news and views from the US and around the world. I'm Phil Kehoe. Today, we're exploring the world of climate journalism. Specifically, how is climate change covered across a variety of media, from short-form rapid response news to long-form narrative documentaries? And how has it evolved over the years? First, Executive Director of Climate Group North America, Angela Barranco, will join with Sammy Roth, climate columnist at the LA Times and host of the new podcast Boiling Point, on how major print publications are covering climate and communicating climate risk, how this has changed, and what we can do to combat misinformation. Then, Climate Group's Adam Lake will speak with Stephanie Abrams, meteorologist at the Weather Channel, to explore how broadcast coverage of climate change has evolved and how audiences are responding to more frequent instances of extreme weather. And finally, Climate Group's Lisa Kaufman will join with Kira Akerman, director of the climate change documentary Hollow Tree, to walk us through her filmmaking process and how long-form media and storytelling can shape the narrative around climate action. In this segment, we explore the print side of things, how print journalism handles climate coverage, how this has changed over time, and what to look forward to in the future. Climate Group's North America Executive Director Angela Barranco speaks with Sammy Roth, climate columnist at the LA Times and host of the new podcast Boiling Point, on how newsrooms are evolving to respond to the climate crisis, communicating risk, and the real-time implications of that coverage. Welcome, Angela and Sammy, to 50 Shades of Green.
Thank you so much, Sammy. We're thrilled to have you on today, so thanks for making the time.
Yeah, very happy to do this. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. So we're catching you at a really interesting time. How are you doing? It's a tough time for LA.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I live on the west side, relatively near to the Palisades fire, although fortunately not in any of the evacuation zones or warning zones. It's a little scary. It's been smoky. The air quality has not been good. Like everyone else, I know people who have had to evacuate and whose homes have burned down. So I've never experienced anything quite like this before. It is a real reminder that, not that I didn't already know this because I write about climate change for a living, but that the climate crisis is here and that it's on our doorstep and that it is affecting and harming a lot of people in real time all over the place. So it's just it's kind of surreal to have the stuff that I write about intersect with my life in such a direct and personal way.
Absolutely. I can't even imagine, sitting at home or at work every single day writing about climate change and then to have that massively clash with everything happening in your community. And obviously we're really sorry to see how everything's happening. But can you tell us a little bit how you ended up covering the climate crisis? What was sort of your pathway to this kind of conversation and what has kept you here?
Sure. I guess I was always interested in it growing up. At a time, I'm relatively young, so it was kind of well known that this was a problem, that this was something we were going to have to deal with it. And I was always a little perplexed why it was that there was political controversy surrounding it. Why was climate denial a thing? I didn't really get it. I was interested in politics as a teenager, and so I sort of didn't understand why was this not something that we were just dealing with. And I ended up studying sustainable development in college. That was my major, and I was a journalism kid. I was an editor on the college paper, and I sort of wanted to put those things together. So coming out of school, I ended up I grew up in LA, and I ended up getting a job at the newspaper in Palm Springs, California, in the desert, covering energy. And that was a really great moment because it was, as an energy reporter, because the first big solar farms in the country were being built right outside of Palm Springs with money from the federal stimulus bill that President Obama signed coming out of the Great Recession. So I was sort of right on the ground floor for the birth of the large-scale solar industry. So it just kind of, took off from there. And I've been covering energy, renewable energy, and climate change ever since.
Amazing. I think what we've seen also is probably when you started, which wasn't even, a generation ago, it was only maybe a decade ago. But, it was a niche kind of a topic, right? What is this thing? Climate change impacts, right? But it's no longer a niche topic, right? It's on the front page every single day, practically. So, How has that been for you? I mean, I feel like how has how have you seen coverage shift or interest or even resources in that time sort of shift radically?
I mean, there's definitely a lot more of it. I mean, that's the first thing, and you just basically alluded to this. I mean, when I started 10 years ago, so I started in 2014, I guess closer to 11 years ago on the energy and climate beat. And not that there still wasn't a pretty good amount of it then. I mean, because there was relative to even a few years before that, but it's just exploded since then. I mean, on the LA Times now, I'm part of a climate environment, science and health team that has, I think we have like 15 reporters. And not everyone is specifically on climate, but we're all doing things that are, environment related. And a lot of it is climate. And if you had told me that 10 years ago, I would have said, wow, that's crazy. Like, there wasn't anything like that at the time. I mean, the papers like the New York Times and the Washington Post are doing that, but hardly anyone else is at quite that level. But there are lots of great publications out there. I mean, probably listeners of this podcast know about Inside Climate News and Canary Media and Grist. I mean, but even at mainstream, print publications and sort of mainstream news outlets, everyone is covering this stuff. I mean, I have trouble keeping up with everything that's being written that's relevant to what I'm reporting on just to stay up to speed. So that's one change. I think the second big thing is that when I started doing this reporting, a lot of the climate coverage was sort of the basics, just like, there was a lot of, is climate change real? Is climate change not real? And ultimately the journalists would tell you if you read closely enough, like, yeah, it's real, but there was still a lot of back and forth in stories where they would say, well, Democrats and scientists are saying this, and Republicans and climate deniers who are being paid by the fossil fuel industry, and maybe the stories would tell you that, and maybe they wouldn't, but they're saying that. And again, you read them closely and you know what's really going on, but there was a lot of false equivalency being presented, and it was sort of just the basics. The journalism today, it is really a lot more comprehensive, a lot more direct, a lot more thorough. It's telling you, with the fires in LA, for instance, a lot of what we're writing at the LA Times, it is giving you the full story. Here's how the climate crisis is connected to what's happening. Here's how and why it's getting worse. Here are the ties to the fossil fuel industry and the pollution that's driving this. It's delving into the politics of why this continues to be the case. Why is this problem so difficult to solve? It's talking about climate adaptation too, and the need to, even as we reduce emissions, here are all of the steps that can and should be taken to help build a more resilient world, to build cities, to build infrastructure, to make our water supplies, our energy supplies, our housing, to adapt to these changes that are underway, that are inevitable. It's really painting a much fuller picture of the world that we live in and the need to change, both to solve the problem or to slow the problem of climate change and to live with the consequences of it. And so that wasn't happening to that extent 10 years ago in the journalism.
It's interesting you say that, because I think we've seen it a lot in the coalitions that we work with as a nonprofit. We work with business, we work with subnational governments, and the same shift, 10 years ago was kind of okay to be like, hey, we all stand together to support climate, right? And now the question is financing, the question is infrastructure development, adaptation, risk mitigation, right? Like, it is much more specific. People are in the conversation very differently, and there's very little of that just generic climate denial. But at the same time, some of it persists. And so a question for you back. I mean, I think we're now in an era of describing and quantifying climate risk, right? Not so much anymore just explaining that it is changing, right? And that's so much what it was before. Like, how are you thinking about communicating risk, right? And communicating the complexities of, like, LA, where do you rebuild? What does it cost? What are the politics of that?
Well, that's a great question. I think one of the themes that I find myself coming back to again and again in my stories, and this is based on the feedback that I hear from a lot of people reading what I write, there's a lot of resistance to change, even among people who know very deeply and understand that climate change is here and that it's presenting all of these risks, and not just risks. I mean, it's doing all of this harm every single day. When you start to get into these conversations about where do you rebuild, where does it make sense to put homes, do we pull back from the sea that is rising? When you talk about changes to the energy system, which is the big thing that I focus on, where do you build big solar farms, and do you put them in places that are sensitive wildlife habitat? How do you finance rooftop solar systems? And do you continue to do it in a way that has, according to a lot of folks, raised electric bills, which has economic consequences for people who can't afford to pay higher electric bills? These are conversations that are really challenging, and there's a lot of resistance to any solution that has a side effect. And unfortunately, every solution, every adaptation measure, with very few exceptions, has a side effect. Um, and none of the side effects, or almost none of them, are as bad as climate change. The alternative to all of these side effects is keep burning fossil fuels and keep making these fires worse and these floods worse and these heat waves worse, which are very, very deadly and ongoing. So to go to your question about communicating risk, it's, as a journalist, I find myself continuously having to just try to find ways to say, like, look, we do have to have these hard conversations about what are the trade-offs, what are the costs and benefits. Like, we can't ignore that because people are talking about that. People want to have that conversation. That's the politics of it. But if we don't also think more broadly about what happens if we don't start making trade-offs, we're stuck in this situation that we're in right now, where LA just keeps burning, and all of these other, Hurricanes Milton and Helene and the Camp Fire and all of these other awful things that are happening. Despite all of the good things I said a minute ago about how journalists have gotten a lot better at this, we're certainly not perfect. And I definitely think in the political sphere in particular, there is still too much journalism that just, not that there's a lot of climate denialism that just gets put out there in news stories credibly these days. We're beyond that. I do think there's still too much political journalism that doesn't do a good enough job of presenting what the risks are of climate change accurately, and creates too much equivalency between fossil fuels and renewable energies, and doesn't present the trade-offs accurately.
Absolutely. We maybe see a lot of this with, like, the opposition is no longer attacking the science to it. They're slowing it down through economics, through other means that make it feel like, well, the cost of this is too high, like and this risk can't be that big, right? But it's really hard, and I really, hats off to you for trying to explain and communicate the broadness of that risk, because it is so clear and present, like with LA, with Florida, with even just you look back a couple of years, the Tahoe fires, like there are so many examples that we can point to. But
it's easy to talk about fires and storms, but heat waves are the deadliest extreme weather event. That gets lost because they don't have the same visuals. But my God, more people die from extreme heat than anything else that's fueled by climate change. And anyway, but yes, I agree with you.
And think about this, that was only 6 months ago, max, where there was massive heat waves going through the entire country. And, I can't even say how many people lost their lives, but I think it was in the hundreds, right?
It's very hard to calculate, and it's usually higher than we know.
Yeah, exactly, because they're not going to blame it on the heat wave. It'll be a heart attack, or it'll be some other kind of thing, right? I guess the thing that I'm interested also in kind of your coverage and how you've seen it kind of evolve is, like, how do you tell the story of opportunity? Because also the negative is so easy to tell, like, oh, the world is burning down, but that also sort of shuts people down. Like, how do you balance that between that and, say, a clean energy message, like, hey, look, California's leading and doing all this great stuff over here, and we have opportunities and jobs are in other places. Like, part of what I think we are struggling with at the moment is not only, we also have to reimagine the future. Like, what could this look like if we get it right? And I know people talk about that in so many different ways, but, like, give people something to work towards, right? Not just the catastrophizing, but it's a hard thing because you have to see the reality of what's in front of us too, right? Like, it's both. And so I'm just curious, like, how do you kind of grapple with that yourself as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. Number one, my job as a journalist is to present reality. So I've got to just tell people what's going on. The fortunate thing is there are some positive realities and hopeful ones, and I have statistics that I like to pull out. And being in California, 2023, most recent year that we have full data for, close to 60% of electricity in California was renewable or zero carbon, which is a big deal.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's solar, wind, geothermal, nuclear, hydropower. Not everyone loves all of those things, but it's low carbon electricity, and that number is continuing to go up. So that's great. New vehicle sales, passenger vehicle sales in California are like a quarter zero emission now. That's mostly battery electric and some plug-in hybrid. And that number is it's starting to level out, but has been rising pretty strongly the last few years. Again, doesn't solve everything, but it's a sign that there's progress being made, and I think Colorado is also close to 25% and is catching up to California. So there's progress being made, and there's other opportunities. I mean, electrification of buildings. You look at heat pumps, and the fact that those sales aren't rising like electric vehicles are, but the costs are coming down. The ability to reduce indoor air pollution, which people are starting to understand more and more. And when you have conversations with folks about the fact that an electric heat pump is cost effective compared to gas heating, and if they go to an electric stove or an induction stove, most people who have used induction stoves actually tell you, hey, they're great, they work just as well, that the costs compare. There's hopeful stories you can tell, and when I tell those stories, I find that people respond really well to them. Then you have to pair that with the other side of the reality, which is even in California, not moving nearly fast enough to meet California's own goals. And for all of the beneficial laws and regulations that California has passed, it seems like there's, for every 2 steps forward, at least one kind of, why are we doing this step backwards? And I write about those as well. So, I think that there's different messages that work for different people. Something that I get frustrated by sometimes is that I hear from people who kind of say, well, why aren't you just doing positive messaging, or why aren't you just doing catastrophic messaging, or why aren't you doing this or that? Like, you have to tell the story in this way. It's like, well, some people respond to hope, and some people respond to fear, and some people want to be angry, and some people,
Yes.
want to be motivated by, people want to be motivated by different things. So I think there's all different types of stories and visions for everybody. And, why don't we just do all of them?
I mean, climate is something, it's like all of society, all of economy, it's touching everything. So I almost feel like it would be impossible to tell just one facet of that story, right? Like, there's just so many elements, so many pieces to it. Yes, it would be difficult to just be like the good news guy on climate.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a general trend. There's not one solution that's gonna. I think that it's such a big problem that it's easier for a lot of people to conceptualize by trying to put it in one box. Yeah. There's no one box.
No, and it really touches everything, small, large, macro, everything, right? You have such, I think, breadth in terms of climate stories and climate interests, and obviously California at the center of both progress and also of risk. So tell us a story you've read very recently that you either want to shine a spotlight on because it's a really interesting angle, or a great reporter, or just something that captured your attention.
Ooh, that's such a hard question. I've read about 100 stories in the last
I'm sure
5 days. I guess one thing I would just say is it's been kind of fascinating to see in the last few days of the Biden administration how much money the Federal Energy Department is pushing out the door to clean energy loan guarantees and conditional loan guarantees, literally tens of billions of dollars to for power lines in the Pacific Northwest and the Midwest, and lithium extraction in the Imperial Valley, and EV truck factories in the Southeast, I think. I mean, all sorts of stuff. It's been going a little bit under the radar because there's been so much going on with the transition to Trump and wildfires, and there's been so much crazy news. But the national monument designations are a big deal too. But
huge.
Just this is all loan guarantee money from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Department of Energy has just been I think they're probably going to be going down to the last day here as we record this a couple days before the inauguration. Just they're probably just, working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, putting as much money out as they can before Trump takes office, and, crossing their fingers that legally that the Trump people can't reverse any of those funds. So it's just, that's Jigger Shaw and his loan programs office, and it's just kind of remarkable how much money they're getting out the door just in the final couple of days. So that's been kind of remarkable to watch.
I mean, and they just named two new monuments in California that put his total above all of the presidents, right? And then, I mean, I am anticipating, like you are, they will go to the last minute at DOE, like 11:59 on the 20th. Like
one of those monuments I'm hoping to write about and actually do an episode of my podcast Boiling Point about in a couple of weeks. Chuckwalla National Monument. My colleague Lila Seidman has been writing about that for the LA Times, and I'm hoping to write some more. Just I'll say it real quickly. It's like 600 plus thousand acres in the southeastern part of California. It's south of Joshua Tree National Park. The several Native American tribes in that part of the state have been pushing for this designation along with conservation organizations. It would go from Joshua Tree down to the Imperial Valley area and down to the Colorado River border with Arizona. And what's really remarkable about this monument, in addition to protecting all of this sacred land for the tribes, it was sort of crafted in this sort of compromise proposal with renewable energy companies and electric utilities to create room for, even as it protects all this land, to sort of have some carve outs for renewable energy development and transmission lines to bring renewable energy to cities on the coast. So it was a sort of, compromise proposal that everyone got on board with as this example of how to balance conservation with renewable energy development, which is a topic that I've written a lot about, going back to the earlier part of our conversation, how to do trade-offs. So I'm hoping to write more about that and to look at does this hold up under Trump, and what does that conservation renewable energy balance look like, if anything, under the Trump administration. So stay tuned for that if you follow my newsletter or my podcast.
Absolutely. I recommend it highly for everyone to check it out, and would love to hear how you sort of break down the opportunity and the challenge there, because I think what I love about the national monument designations is often they're like decades in the making, right? Like communities have been working for 10, 20, 30 years to do this. And so, like you say, it doesn't make it to national monument designation unless you've worked out some of the really thorniest issues. And I think could be such a great playbook as we move forward, is to think like, how did they do this? What were they able to accomplish by it through agreement and not just through kind of like lobbing bombs back and forth? Because at the end of the day, we're going to have to do this a lot of places. Could that be an interesting playbook for others? I always think about, how do we share that knowledge? How do we like shortcut other people's journeys in these really complex times, right? And so, yeah. I hope people do tune in.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. Well, one more question, just kind of picking up a little bit on what you said. That the coverage is not perfect ever, and that's just the journey of also journalism. I think one of the things we as a human species over the last few years have come to appreciate is the power of misinformation, right? The power of our inability to always understand how to recognize things that are not that are propagandic, that are there to give us a message rather than information. How do you think about misinformation as a journalist today? Like, how would you also recommend our audience and others who tend to be high information consumers, right, to be thinking about misinformation or talking to others about it? Because I know it's something that I'm sure you're thinking about a lot.
Gosh, yeah, there's so much of it out there, and so much of it that's designed to mislead. This is going to sound like self-serving advice, and in a way that it is, the best advice I can give is subscribe to news outlets. Pay for good information to the extent possible. Don't spend, don't get your news from social media. Really don't rely on X or Instagram or Facebook. For good news. Like, be skeptical of, like, if you're just scrolling and see someone, tweet a screenshot of something that's an article, like, don't make that how you get information. Like, pay for your local news organization, pay for a national news organization, like sign up for newsletters, listen to podcasts. From real, journalists and news sources that you have reason to trust and believe in. Go there when you want to find out what's really going on, and use the rest of it for fluff and fun, but don't depend on it for real information about what's happening in the world. that's where you start to and say that's just where you start to get lost and where you start to fall down rabbit holes and you don't even know that it's happening. You just assume that it's real without even thinking about it, and then then you start to believe things that turn out to not be true.
Absolutely. And I think we're so saturated by information from so many different places, right? It's almost hard. We can distinguish things, or we think we can. We give ourselves a lot of credit for, I think, being able to understand when things are real or not. And you just can't, right? Like
it's happened to me with people in my own family and close friends who are, smart, well-educated, thoughtful, and read plenty of real news, but they were, saw something on Instagram or on X and said, "Hey, did you hear this?" And I think about it for a second. That doesn't sound right. And I look it up and I'll trace it and I'll say, "Hey, that was not real. Like that did not come from a real journalist. That was BS." And it's like, oh, well, geez, I probably should have figured that out. It's like, no, I hear you. It's like, but that's just what happens when you spend too much time in those places and start to depend on that for information.
We're just thrilled that you're able to share your perspectives here. And yes, please do check out Sammy's podcast, which we all did and we love. So we can highly recommend Boiling Point. If there was like one last word you would leave everyone sort of thinking about at this particular moment when it comes to climate, the intersection with people, politics, the things you write about every day, kind of what is the takeaway that you want everyone to have at this particular moment, knowing that in a year, 10 years, it's going to change. But right now, what should people really be focused on?
Climate is something that a lot of people, when they're asked about, say, "Oh yeah, I care about that. That's important to me." But when it comes time to vote or to decide what to read about or what to talk about, it just, it's like 12th on their list of things that they actually care about. So for those of you who are listening to podcasts like this one, who it really is a priority for, do everything you can to make it more of a real priority for other people in your life for whom it doesn't rank as highly. Like, be annoying, bring it up when it comes time to vote or to decide what to talk about at dinner or to decide what to read about or what news organizations to support. Just, encourage the people around you to make climate a priority, to like bother them about it. You'll probably feel kind of bad because it's depressing sometimes, but that's, I think, one of the important ways that we get there. Just put it at the front of people's consciousness all the time, even when they don't want to hear about it.
I think great advice for all of us. And thank you, Sammy Roth, for joining us. Really appreciate it. And yes, definitely check out your podcast and your column on the LA Times. By the way, I'm a subscriber, so yay.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you.
Yeah. Really welcome you back anytime. We'd love to keep chatting about how, especially the LA fires and the ramifications of that through the year will really unfold. So thanks so much for taking the time now when it's so crazy.
You're welcome. Climate change is battering California. Wildfires, heat waves, droughts, floods, sea level rise, they're all getting worse. That's why the Golden State is burning less oil and gas and investing in renewable power. I'm Sammy Roth. I've been reporting on energy and climate change in California and across the American West for a decade. I've seen firsthand how these stories touch lives, livelihoods, and landscapes, sometimes for worse, sometimes for better. From the Los Angeles Times, this is Boiling Point. I'll be asking scientists, politicians, activists, and journalists the same questions. What are the challenges we face to building a better world? And what are the solutions we need to embrace, even when it's hard? Boiling Point will be available everywhere you listen to podcasts, starting January 16.
How are major broadcasters covering the climate crisis, and how has this coverage evolved over the years? Next up, Climate Group's Adam Lake speaks with Stephanie Abrams, meteorologist at the Weather Channel, for an in-depth look at broadcast climate coverage and how it shaped the way audiences perceive and react to the climate crisis. Welcome, Adam and Stephanie, to 50 Shades of Green.
Stephanie, really great to see you again.
You as well. It's always great hanging out with anyone from your team, so I'm excited for this.
We've got a really interesting episode today, and it's obviously incredibly timely as well. So we're really grateful to spend some time with you. And just to get a bit of an insight from your point of view on weather and climate and how people engage with these stories just here and around the world. Obviously, we know you very well. You've been involved in Climate Week NYC and so many other. You've been taking over the Climate Group's Instagram, which is something we very rarely do. So there is definitely a circle of trust here. So obviously, people in the US, our US listeners will likely know who you are from the Weather Channel. But for our international audience, it would be just great to hear. Tell us a bit more about what you do and who you work for, and why you're so passionate about talking about the weather.
Cool. So my name is Stephanie Abrams. I was born and raised in South Florida, and I was actually influenced by the weather a lot growing up. I grew up playing tennis, and I remember one day when I was little, it was kind of raining on our side of the street, but not the other side of the street. I was like, how does that happen? And then Hurricane Andrew happened in 1992, which was a Category 5 hurricane, and that hit down a little bit farther south. I grew up in West Palm, and that hit more Miami down to Homestead. But I remember seeing the damage from that, and I'm like, how does wind and rain make that happen? I always had these influences. And then I loved science. I loved math. My dad had a telescope. I went to space camp twice. I've always been like a math and science lover. So really long story short, I went to the University of Florida and I took oceanography. I thought I was going to be a volcanologist for a while. I did geology. I took every math and science I could possibly do. And I ended up taking a just intro level meteorology class. I'm like, oh, this is cool. This takes all the science disciplines and puts them into one. Now, American football, a little different than the football you're used to, Adam, but I'm a diehard SEC fan for all the American football lovers out there. And so they didn't have a meteorology major at Florida. So I got a degree in geography and a minor in math, and then went to Florida State, which is a rival of UF, and ended up getting my meteorology degree from Florida State after that. So I have a degree in meteorology, geography, and a minor in math. And then after that, I started working in the local ABC affiliate in Tallahassee, Florida. And this is actually just good advice for anyone that's looking for a job. One of my professors was like, reach out to all the alumni and connect with them. And I was like, oh, that's a great idea. And so I'm like, hi, my name's Stephanie. Will you critique my tape? Because back then you used a VHS tape. And I sent it to agents and so I made a lot of—
I can hear the noise now, the tape going in and whirring.
You know the exact sound, right? So I made some connections that way. And one of the alumni happened to work at the Weather Channel, which, again, long story short, I ended up coming in an interview, and I started at the Weather Channel in 2003. So I'm going on, 22 years now, which is wild. And over those 20 some odd years, I've done everything you could possibly do here.
I remember when I was a kid. I mean, we're talking about like when I was like 8 years old, so way over 30 years ago. I grew up in England, and my primary school is when between the age of like 5 and 10 was right next to the UK Met Office, which did the weather for the country.
Yes.
And so when we did art class, it was actually the huge paper maps that the Met Office used,
Yes,
where they were drawing different weather lines. And so I remember as a kid being fascinated. I imagine that, meteorology is very different these days, that you don't have the pencils out and the physical bits of paper. How has it changed over the years since you've been in this career?
well, just the meteorology part of it. We used to have those as well. We had a map wall at Florida State where they print out, and the atmosphere is like a hamburger. That's how I like to describe it. And so you have to look at each layer of the atmosphere. And so you have all the layers of the atmosphere and all of their different charts on the wall. And we would do that hand analysis. Now, I don't know if they still print them out. I should ask, professors that are still there if they still do that. But of course, we don't do that at the Weather Channel. Everything is on the computer. All the models are on the computer. All the warnings. When I first got to the Weather Channel, we'd print out all the tornado warnings and line them up. Now it's on a screen for us. So it's really just the technology has helped make everything more efficient and save a lot of paper in the process.
So one of the things that we're talking about today is about the link between the weather and the climate.
Yeah.
And I these days where people they can watch you on TV or they go on the app on their phone, sometimes it feels like weather's just something that happens. But when you're on the inside and you're looking at the science of what creates the weather, I imagine that gives you a slightly different perspective on the relationship between the climate and the weather that we experience. Like, how is that for you?
I think that's a really good point and really interesting too, because a lot of people might not relate something that's happening in the weather to the climate, right? So I think us helping to make that connection, whether it's, king tides, when you have flooding on sunny days, or the strength of hurricanes, or the fires, or whatever it may be. I think that for us, we're able to say, okay, this event is weather, it's happening right now. And we can't say, because of climate change, this hurricane happened. Because of climate change, this tornado happened. But what we can tell people is, well, because of what's happening in the atmosphere, there's a 2% or 2 times higher chance that this happened because of climate change, or a 5 times higher chance, depending on the type of weather, that this happened because of climate change. And we can make those links for people. And so they can start thinking like, oh, this isn't just random.
Do you think that's something that we're seeing more of over the years? That climate change is becoming more of the story when we're talking about these different weather events?
100%. And we see it even here. I've seen it here at the Weather Channel. Climate's always been there, but now it is front and center. I do a show, we can talk about that too a little bit later, called Pattern. We have a climate talk show that we do weekly here. Whenever I'm in the field, our team will say, I remember us covering a hurricane a few years ago. They're like, hey, Steph, will you do a climate basic social media post for us that talks about hurricanes and climate? So it's definitely getting sprinkled into the stories, the live shots, the programming. It's everywhere, really, kind of part of the whole network now. We are the Weather Channel, but it's in everything we do.
We live in very interesting times, and one of the things that I've always found quite curious working in climate change and on Climate Week NYC is just how politically charged talking about the link between climate change and the weather is. Like, why do you think that might be?
I mean, first of all, I feel like everything is so politically charged, isn't it, this
That
days?
is true.
It is. And a lot of people listen to people that maybe aren't necessarily experts or have the knowledge of the data, or they listen to their emotional response to something that happened. Mm-hmm. And so they experience that and they feel that to be true. And what I've learned when it comes to climate is I had a friend who, years ago wasn't really on the climate, train and saying, oh, it's not true. And I remember saying to her, like, but why do we need to treat the planet poorly? Like, I don't understand why this is a political thing, or like, all we're trying to do is like, if we get rid of plastic bags, it's for the better. If we use glass instead of why, I don't understand why anyone would argue just doing better for the planet and for our health.
And I guess one of the go-to responses I always have is one of air quality, because you can't mythologize about air quality and you can't mythologize about asthma rates. And obviously there's a strong link between the weather and that. Do you ever see different parts of the United States deal with weather in different ways? There is a disparity on the impact on different communities. Do you ever pick that up from, obviously, your coverage? You go around the country. Is that something that you see?
Yeah, obviously, where there's more funding, there's going to be, a better plan in place, and they're not as impacted. That is definitely, there's disparities when it comes to that funding. And real quick, I want to jump back to say too, is like, when it comes to the climate and politics and emotions and everything else, if someone's not open to hearing actual data and facts, there's not much we can do about that, right? And that comes across with everything we do too. So it's the same thing with fundings. Like, you have to be open to the fact that certain areas have more funding and are building different things to protect their people. Or when it comes to chemical plants being built, Cancer Alley and those types of areas. I mean, it really does make a difference.
One of the, as I mentioned earlier, I'm British, and one of the stereotypes about the Brits is we.
By the way,
love
I'm married to a
about...
Brit. Born and raised in London, so.
Oh, there we are. So
Oh, not born. Sorry, I wasn't born there, but he moved there at 6 months. I just want to make sure I say that. He's moved there at 6 months.
Good fact check there. One of the stereotypes is we love talking about the weather, and one of my theories is because the weather hardly changes in the UK at all, the slightest change gives us a conversation. But obviously, the weather is something that people talk about hugely in the United States as well. I wonder, why do you think it is something that people, since the dawn of time, people have always been fascinated by the weather? And obviously with social media and television and other medias, that hasn't changed. If anything, people are talking about it even more. Why do you think weather is something that's so close to people's hearts?
Because it impacts us no matter what we do, whether it comes to our house, whether it comes to our bills, whether it comes to our food, whether it comes to our physical body, if we're walking out the door. It literally touches every aspect of our life. So you can't escape it. And it's starting to change. By the way, I've been in London. We go back, a couple times a year to see his family. And it's been really hot there lately. I mean, I used to go over there and not have to worry about that. It's been super hot at times. I'm like, what is happening over here?
I was there a couple of weeks ago for the holidays to see my family, and it's very, very, very cold in London right now. And I'm in New York City, and it's very, very cold here right now. And I'm sure you get this a lot, but sometimes, especially if you're known to work in climate, or I'm sure in weather as well, people sometimes go up to you half jokingly, half not. And they're saying, well, where's this climate change you keep talking about right now? Now, I know my stock response to those sorts of questions, but what's the sort of thing that you say when people say stuff like that?
Again, this is about being open to educate yourself. It's all about having an open mind, about educating yourself and actually understanding what the changing climate means. So I tell people, again, just very simple, and I'm curious what your answer is like, it's not all about hot. You get hotter hot, colder cold, wetter wet, drier dry. That is the easiest way that I can try to break through to someone who says something like that. Now, whether they want to believe it, it's up to them, but I got the numbers if they want to see it,
Yeah, I always just say it's about screwing things up. When you screw things up, they go in all sorts of different directions.
Yeah, that's a good one. I might have to use that.
I'm a lot less smart on this stuff than you, so I'd stick with your one personally. I'd love to look a little bit about, the impact of this discussion, what it's like on the newsroom. So both in weather, but obviously, the weather, I know you're featured in a lot of other stories that are looking at it from a news angle, and they want some expert advice and comment on that sort of. How do you think climate change has developed as an issue on the newsroom?
I think because it's in every aspect, I will say, like I was saying before. So it's definitely there. And it's definitely now when stories are getting pitched and people are talking, it's kind of like, well, what's the climate angle? We have these horrible fires going on in Southern California now. And obviously we're giving a lot of attention to those and the weather aspect and homes. But I just saw yesterday an interview of a couple who had built a sustainable home and immediately sent it to our team. And they literally had certain material that was not flammable, the roof not and they go through all the details of that. And they actually even had little sprinklers that would pop up and spray fire retardant, and they could activate those when the fire was getting close. And so while we're telling the stories of people recovering and surviving and the weather aspect, there's also an opportunity where there's a story where someone might watch that and say, you know what, that's how I'm going to rebuild. And then their home will be sustainable in the next fire and hopefully stay standing.
I find that link between what we call in climate land the built environment, but also fires and weather impacts absolutely fascinating. I think we all saw the recent fires in Los Angeles. I believe it's the most expensive weather-related disaster in the history of mankind, and that's before you even start looking at the human impact as well. And I think as a society we have to start looking at how we build, how we adapt around these things. I think it's interesting in London, the only building that has a straw roof is Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, because when there was the Great Fire of London 400 years ago, there was a law that you cannot have a straw roof. It is illegal. They had to change the law to do that. And I think it'll be really interesting to see in places like Los Angeles, but across the rest of the United States, maybe governments and other organizations are going to have to start, and insurance companies, maybe we're going to have to look at how we build things differently in order to survive this. Do you think that's a likely outcome?
I do. I mean, after Hurricane Andrew, they did change the building code. And this does happen, from time to time and place to place when they have this. And so I hope that they change codes in some areas, because that will force people. The only problem with that is the financial aspect of that when it comes to the building codes. And so maybe there'll be some programs to help, in that way. And obviously it's a very complex and layered issue, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is perhaps even just moving, you can't have something that really isn't costly is moving plants maybe away from your home. They have to be a certain distance away. And I don't know the laws and regulations with that. But then you run into, well, I want the tree to shade my house to take down the electricity. So it's a complicated issue, obviously.
So you're in this really exciting position where you're telling the world every day about the weather and what it means and what's coming. I'd love to know from your perspective, what's the most exciting part of your job?
Oh, there's so many exciting things about. I mean, first of all, I love that it changes every day, because I'm on TV Monday through Friday, doing the weather from 6 to 10, and then we do our climate show on Thursdays. And so what's really exciting is that I'm engaging too with people like you and your whole team that are really passionate about the climate, for instance. And what I think is really cool is all the unique people that we have on our show that are actually making a difference and inventing things that are making the world a better place. And I think that's what gets me the most like revved up is when someone comes on and I'm like, why did I think of that? Or it's such a good idea. Or I'm so excited to see what you think of next type of a thing.
Now we know when there are lots of big weather stories that completely take over the news, the recent fires being one, but obviously when there's a hurricane or a flood or other things. But there are so many other critical stories that are perhaps, slower burn over the years. Do you think there's a weather story out there that doesn't get the attention that it might deserve?
Yeah, I think that when you're talking weather and climate, I think that migration due to the weather and the changing climate. I know it is a big story and we hear the stories, but I think it's only going to get bigger. We hear a lot about building buildings differently and infrastructure, and we hear a lot of those stories. But I think that where we're getting more droughts, again, the drier dry, the wetter wet, the hotter hot, people are going to have to move because food is not being grown. They can't live in areas anymore. And so I think over time, and that's around the world, that's everyone is impacted by that's going to have a huge impact over time.
I completely agree with you. I was at an event, a climate event in Florida last year, hearing about a story from a child psychologist who focused on young people who are refugees from south of the border who've come through. And a very common thing is families have farmland and the farmland is just dying. And in some of these areas, there's high levels of criminality and the parents have to make a choice between starvation, criminality, or crossing the border. And they choose the border. And these are young children who are very, very shaken and very disturbed by this. And so it's really interesting to hear stories from psychologists who are actually providing that support and help. And you don't immediately think of that when you think about, oh, it's a few degrees hotter here or this, that, the other. I think that migration piece is and it's something that's probably politically it's a problem that's going to get worse and
Absolutely.
And not better.
Absolutely.
Do you think, oh, no, please.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Is that something that you think is going to be, become a much bigger storyline over the future? Are there other areas that you think we might start hearing about more often that we don't hear so much?
Well, I think that we hear the stories and you guys talk about it, we talk about it, but things that happen all the time that people don't think about, like the water encroaching, or the erosion happening. I mean, here, like on the East Coast, especially, and I know it happens on the West Coast too, actually, on the coastal areas, like homes are literally falling into the water. That's only going to continue. And people are buying these homes and it's happening faster and faster. And so I think this is going to be a massive problem as well. Again, not only in America, but around the world. We know in the was it Vanuatu where they had their prime minister, I think, standing in the water, if I'm correct, talking about their water rising. It's like people are going to have to move and readjust or build differently. I don't have the answer to any of it, but I think that that's going to be hitting us hard as well as a lot of these coastal areas. And then, I mean, of course, you have these fires too, and that's not just at the coast, that's inland. So I think things like that, when they're happening more and more and more frequently, and think about hurricanes. We had Helene come in at the coast and people think, I'm safe, I'm inland, I'm in the mountains, it's not going to affect me. And then you have it, destroy Western North Carolina. So it's like, you can't escape it. And you have hurricanes that cause terrible flooding inland. People haven't thought about that. I mean, we try to say it as much as we can. And I try to say, listen, even if you don't live by the coast, you're going to be impacted. We do our best with that, but you're seeing it more and more. And maybe people are now, realizing that.
I always find it really interesting when I'm speaking to people who have a public facing role, because when you deal with the public face to face, whether it's in person or social media, with the feedback that you get from TV, it's one of the most honest ways of understanding where public sentiment lies. From where you sit, what do you think of the sorts of stories that resonate most with the general public in the United States?
Well, I think that there's kind of two ways to do it. So our climate talk show pattern, how we produce that is we try to make it fast-paced, action-packed, interesting stories about the person that cleans the wind turbines, or the person that's, making ottomans out of old tires. I think that if you can hide the Brussels sprouts in the potato, it's the best way, if you will. Though I like Brussels sprouts, but you get what I'm saying.
I love Brussels sprouts.
I do too. I shouldn't hate on Brussels sprouts. All right, some sort of green that you don't like, right? Into the potatoes, and tell these stories to get people interested and pull them in, and then just give them a little dollop of, gravy, if you will, with some of the more hardcore facts. Because I think that's the hardest thing for people is, and us being scientists, we are data, 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 data. And that's how I came up with a hamburger and kind of, all these little things I came up with to get people engaged. Different segments like that, where you can pull them in and they're eating their greens, but they're enjoying it at the same time, if you will.
I love that. And imagine though, there's another element to this also when you're storytelling, which is there's such a huge amount of misinformation, and the role of social media has just become ginormous. What do you see your role in that, in sort of going against and combating misinformation?
So I have a huge responsibility in the position I'm in, and I take that very seriously, to get the information correct. And I take that, and the Weather Channel takes that very serious. If someone, as we were talking about earlier, isn't open to actually hearing the correct information, there's literally nothing I can do about that. So all I can do is stay consistent and make sure that I have the proper information, make sure I engage people in, again, a fun way that's not combative. I think that is the best that I can do. And just for the record, I literally, and you can look back at my tweets, I don't respond to negativity. And so if someone's being a jerk, they get blocked, deleted, whatever. I don't even engage. If someone sends me a nasty gram about something I posted, well, that's not true, this, that, and the other, I just let them go. I mean, unless there's someone that would say, hey, where did you find this? Or how, then I'm willing to have a conversation. Otherwise, I'm not going to engage with the chaos. And by the way, I will say, for people that have this type of thing on social media, what's interesting is very few people actually interact with me like that anymore, because no one is going to get a reaction out of me. Yeah. So I just don't seem to get kind of nasty grams, and just consistently give information and take it. And if you're open to a conversation, I'm here.
Don't feed the trolls is always good advice. And I was listening to a podcast last week with a UK politician who's just been the victim of a real tirade after being called out by, let's just say, quite a significant figure in social media land. And she said it was quite humbling that the whole world was falling apart on social media, that when she went home, her family had no idea what was going on. I think it's always important to remember that certain social media platforms don't exist beyond that platform. I'd love to end on a question that's perhaps a bit more personal, a bit more silly as well, which is, I constantly have fights and arguments with people. Some people are winter people. They like the cold and they like the snow. And some people are summer people and they love the heat. Which one are you?
That's a good one, because I think it's kind of changed as I've gotten older. I was born and raised in South Florida, so I didn't know that, snow existed. I'm kidding. But, like in the winter, we're still in shorts and whatever. And when I love the heat and humidity, and I moved north, the Weather Channel's based in Atlanta, Georgia, and I was like, oh, this cold, I hate it. Now that I've gotten older, I can't sit out in the heat and humidity anymore. My blood can't handle it. And I get so hot and I'm dizzy. And so now I'm I don't know, I kind of like it a little cooler, and I like, the seasons and everything. So I think I've kind of transitioned. When I go down to Florida for a hurricane, I'm I used to play tennis in this for hours. I'd run around, it didn't faze me. And now I'm just standing there working, and, and I'm I'm not going to make it. So I think I'm transitioning to more of a fall girly, if you will. Maybe not like hardcore winter, but probably a fall girly.
I'm still more. Having only lived in America for 2 years, and the weather in the UK not
Yeah,
being
you're
so
probably
hot,
all about the sun.
the shock in the restaurant where I'm the only person sitting outside completely in the sun. I'm still enjoying that, but maybe that will change. We're in the middle of the winter now. We've got spring,
Yeah.
summer, and fall to come. So, Stephanie, it's been so great speaking with you and hearing a bit more about the work that you do, and the important connection that has with storytelling, newsrooms, and the climate. And as always, it's great to chat. I'm sure we're going to see you again, whether it's at the US
Yes.
Climate Action Summit or Climate Week NYC. But I'm going to let you get back to the studio and tell the nation what's going to go on for
Thank
the
you,
week
Adam.
ahead.
It was fun talking with you.
Thank you.
How can long-form storytelling shape climate action and change public perception? Climate Group's Lisa Kaufman is here with filmmaker and educator Kira Akerman to discuss Kira's insightful and compelling documentary, Hollow Tree. Screened at the inaugural Climate Film Festival as part of Climate Week NYC 2024, Hollow Tree follows three teenagers coming of age in their sinking home place of Louisiana. For the first time, they notice the Mississippi River's engineering, stumps of cypress trees, and polluting refineries. Their different perspectives as indigenous, white, and Angolan young women shape their story of the climate crisis. Lisa and Kira, welcome to 50 Shades of Green.
Thanks, Phil. Really happy to be here. And Kira, delighted to meet you and to have you here to discuss your film today.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and I just want to say, really loved the film and the way that you were able to weave the stories of those three principal women into the history of Louisiana as well as the climate history. So yeah, really excited to dive into that and also just learn about you, which is where I wanted to start. It would be great if you could share with me and our audience just a little bit about your background, how you got into filmmaking. Just anything you want to share to kind of set the scene.
Yeah. So I grew up in New York City, and at the time there were a lot of independent theaters there, and my mom would take me to Lincoln Plaza Cinema, which was in my neighborhood, and played a lot of foreign independent films. And then there was the Film Forum downtown. So I saw a lot of movies, always. And then I went to Wesleyan University, which has a very strong film program. I didn't study film there. I studied writing and studio art, but I ended up moving to New Orleans because of the strong Wesleyan community there. And a lot of people had moved down after Hurricane Katrina to make the film Beasts of the Southern Wild. So I was very much part of that community of filmmakers. So that's sort of how I got into film. I think I was drawn to film. I was thinking about this question. A friend of mine recently said, kind of offhandedly, "Isn't life a lot of elephants in the room?" And I think I'm interested in filmmaking for its ability to capture the so-called elephants, this interplay of silence and bodily gestures, language, and meaning, which no other medium is able to render so well.
I love that. Yeah, thanks for sharing the background and kind of the trajectory that you took. I'm curious, quickly, just in terms of climate specifically, was it until you moved to Louisiana and you saw you maybe working on or seeing your colleagues working on it that you specifically wanted to go in that direction? Or was that something that was always in the back of your mind to explore?
No, I mean, I didn't work on Beasts of the Southern Wild, but I moved to New Orleans because of the filmmakers who had made Beasts of the Southern Wild and were continuing to make work in a way that was very different from filmmakers in LA or New York, for example. I have always been somebody who's been drawn to being in nature and liked the woods, but and I've always felt very attuned to my surroundings, but I wasn't thinking about climate change, and I really didn't know very much about New Orleans or where I was going. When I arrived there, I hadn't spent any time in the South until that point in my life. And it wasn't until really, I think 2017 when I received funding from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities to make a short film about water. And a good friend of mine who was at the time working for Wagner and Ball, which is an architectural firm, they were contending with how to live it with water in the city post Katrina and what would it look like to live with it differently and to instead of covering it up with concrete and pushing it out with pumps and hiding it behind levees, how do we actually accept it more like the Dutch and live with it and not deny it since New Orleans is a swamp paved over and is quite watery. And Aaron is my friend's name. He said, like, can you make a film about pump stations? And I didn't know what a pump station was. I didn't even know that New Orleans was a swamp, really. I didn't know that in every moment water was ejected and pushed out into Lake Pontchartrain and surrounding water bodies. And I said yes anyway, I would make this movie. And then I started to think about, like, oh my God, like, what have I gotten myself into? I don't know, like, I don't know what I'm doing. And tried to figure out how to make it a film that felt personal to me. And that's sort of how I arrived at the process with which I make my films, which is co-learning with young people about our environments and who we are and how our infrastructure shapes who we are in conscious and unconscious ways. I guess also to note, Aaron and another friend of mine started a kind of educational experiment at the time for young people to learn about water in the city. And the impetus for that was a young person in a classroom asking, why has nobody ever told us that we're sinking? And that's rewinding. That's how I came to telling stories about our place in the world, our physical location, and the infrastructure that shapes us.
Yeah, that's fascinating and such a unique process that you use for your films and working with the community and the space and the infrastructure, like you said. And so, yeah, kind of fast forwarding to this film in Hollow Tree, would love to hear specifically how you built that narrative. You kind of touched on your process, but maybe specifically for this film, if you could share what that was like. Did you have a script? And also would love to hear about the three women and how you met them and how you chose to incorporate them into the film.
Yeah. I guess first I'll just say that that first short film is called Station 15 and it's on PBS and you can freely watch it on the internet. So
great.
Definitely no script. This is a documentary. I call my process of filmmaking as a classroom in which I co-learn alongside the young people in my film, and their questions and curiosity guide the narrative. So I began Hollow Tree researching the topics in the film with producer, writer Chachi Hauser. Together, we drove across the state of Louisiana, meeting people. We did this research together so that when the protagonists, who were the three young women who were high school students at the time, when they had questions, I could guide them toward exploring it more fully. And
you could guide them, if they have a question, you can guide them where they could go to find the answers within their community. Is that
and to ask more questions too, because sometimes the process is just how do you ask a better and better question. And we all live along the Mississippi River in Southeast Louisiana. And from the onset, I knew that the Mississippi River was the spine of the story and that we would relate ourselves to it. And I knew that we were segregated from one another and one another's experiences as white, Angolan, Indigenous women. And my instinct was that if we all shared parts of the story of this place and what we were experiencing here, we could tell a fuller, more complex story. And the film is a documentation of us discovering each other and the river and asking a lot of questions along the way.
Yeah, that's amazing. And how did you meet those three women?
So I had a more formal casting process as you would in a fiction film, and drove across the state interviewing young people and asking them what do you notice changing in your environment? What are you learning in school? What are you not learning in school? And that was helpful in terms of getting a pulse on where young people in different parts of Louisiana were at. In each place, there were kind of choruses of people who were advocating for this young person to be part of the project for a variety of reasons. And so I reached out to each of them and we interviewed them and asked them like what their questions were about their home place. And yeah, that was it basically.
Amazing. Yeah, and I think it's great that you're all from such different communities and backgrounds, and then able to plant the seeds of the knowledge and share it within their communities, and kind of spread it out that way. And then zooming out with this, using film as a medium and also spreading the roots or the knowledge that they have beyond those communities and out into the wider world. I would love to hear from you. What kind of stories do you think, or why do you think that climate and these types of stories are best told via film, and how you find reaching these wider audiences through documentary filmmaking?
Yeah.
And just what your experience has been.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think climate change affects every aspect of our lives. Some of the connections are not necessarily obvious to everybody, and I think filmmaking really lends itself to making those types of connections. And then I think film is a kind of emotional archaeology.
That's great. In terms of audience takeaways, so obviously each audience member is going to have a different reaction, but did you have an intention that you wanted them, or just something for them to take away after watching this film?
I think I am very opposed to singular messages. Of course, the film is taking you on a specific journey, and I hoped that audiences would be inspired by Annabelle, Mackenzie, and Tanyelma to ask questions like they're asking on screen, and to notice their own environments and to connect with others in their community, to ask questions across generations, and to be with the complexity of our present time and to feel where we are. There's explanations as to why the seas are warming as fast as they are, and is the only way to disentangle which parts of the past we leave behind and which parts we carry forward. And I think if we can't do that work together, then we can't create solutions to the climate crisis that don't simply repeat the same extractive patterns that have resulted in the climate crisis.
At Climate Group, and just in general, using these various tools that we have in front of us to enact change, and also just being curious. And so I love that as kind of the foundation to which you then launch and perhaps do, we work on policy and working with public and private sector, but there's so many ways that you can kind of segue into that climate activism. I also wanted to ask, going to fundraising and just knowing the nature of film and how fundraising can be, sometimes the biggest hurdle or obstacle. What was that process like for you? It sounds like you've had a relationship with grants in Louisiana that were perhaps local and community-based. But yeah, did you do crowdfunding, grants, foundations? Were people interested in supporting this type of message and story? Would love to hear about that fundraising journey for you.
Fundraising is really hard, and it takes a tremendous amount of work. And I'm very fortunate that a friend of mine who lives in Louisiana and is very committed to Louisiana and water issues here was able to give me a grant essentially to start this project. And that really allowed for me to take risks with my team and to be radical and to follow our intuition. We made a small work sample and ended up, once you have a grant from Sundance, it's a bit easier to get grant funding from other places. And I wrote so many grants with one of the film's producers, Chachi, and we must have gotten myriad rejections and also quite a few acceptances from the Redford Center, Fork Films, NEA, Harnish Foundation, Southern Documentary Fund, and many others. And then we also received foundation funding and donations from individuals. We did a bunch of fundraisers, and our credit sequence and where the thanks comes in, it takes 2 minutes. So it really took a village to make this film, and everyone who's ever been close to me has supported it and contributed it in some way, and I am unspeakably grateful to them for that.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, for a film that's so based in community, it makes sense that it took a large community to get it off the ground and to shepherd it through to post-production. And yeah, so my last two questions are kind of, the what's next. For Hollow Tree itself, I'm assuming or asking if it's done with a festival circuit, and then is it available for our audience to watch online? Are you going to work with a distributor? Just what's happening there for Hollow Tree and for anyone who wants to see it.
Yeah, so we've been screening it really widely. We've screened it at museums and universities and festivals across the country and internationally. We are hoping for a broadcast and in conversation about one, but don't yet have one. At the moment, the best way to host a screening is to contact us through our website, hollowtreefilm.com. I guess I'll also add, I'm partnering with the Climate Museum in New York and the Columbia Climate School, and we're planning screenings together along with creative writing workshops.
Yeah. That's amazing. It's great to see that it's not just ending when the credits roll. There's such a way to continue to be engaged. If you're in New York City, it sounds like there's going to be a ton of upcoming opportunities to be involved or to watch the film. And then if you want to support the independent filmmaking and ongoing education in terms of environment, check out the Hollow Tree website.
There'll be and then there's a screening page on there too, so you can click and out like when the upcoming screenings are.
Perfect. And then my last question is, what's next for you? It sounds like you gave us a snippet of that, but is there any other films on the horizon? And would love to hear a little bit about that.
I am evolving the themes in Hollow Tree into a new project and co-directing with a young person who is from Dulac, Louisiana. Her name is Mariah Hernandez Fitch. She's incredible. And is working with many of the same collaborators from Hollow Tree, including producer Monique Walton, who also has a film out right now called Sing Sing, which everyone should go see. Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
It's awesome. It's so good. I'm deep in it, and stay tuned, and there'll be more about it as it emerges. Yeah.
That's amazing. Great. More to come, it sounds like. I think it will be fascinating to see how those who see the film or those who are part of the film continue to ask questions, and how those questions perhaps turn into action and continued learning and just, spreading of information that we should all have access to take care of our planet. Kira, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to talk to you about this film and just to hear more about your background and also what you're up to next.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate your being interested and chatting with you.
Thanks again for tuning in, and a special shout out to our guests, Sammy Roth, Stephanie Abrams, and Kira Akerman. Be sure to check us out online at climategroup.org, and remember to subscribe on all major streaming platforms. Climate Group's 50 Shades of Green is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music. Stay well, and we'll see you next time.